Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's workshop, Concepts of Qualitative Research Methodology. And this workshop is hosted by the Research Capacity Development here at the University of Johannesburg. So I just want a show of virtual thumb if you can hear me. Thank you, Francis. Thank you for that. All right. So I just want to thank everybody for their time and supporting the RCD unit. We really do appreciate it. My name is Andrea Josiah, and I will be your moderator for today. Firstly, I would like to notify you that the session is being recorded, and just so you know. And we just want to thank all our attendees again for taking the time to join us. And I'm sure that this workshop will be extremely beneficial in your research journey. More importantly, we would want to thank our presenter, Ms. Ragi Bashanga, for her effort in preparing and giving this presentation. Before this workshop starts, I would like to go over some housekeeping rules. Firstly, if you do have any questions during the presentation, please raise your hand. I will then enable your mic, then you can unmute from your side and then ask your question. Or if you're feeling a little shy, you can always type your question in the chat box. It is at this point that I will pause to ask Ms. Bashonga, do you prefer a more interactive session or do you want the questions at the end?
I would prefer a more interactive session. I've planned it for that. So the more comments, feedback, like live voices I have, the better.
Okay, awesome. All right, attendees, you've heard it from our presenter. She would like a more interactive session, so please don't be shy. Okay, so our next housekeeping rule is that, or rather notification, is that the session is recorded, as I previously mentioned. So the presentation slides will be requested from the presenter, and the slides together with the recording will be uploaded onto Moodle under workshop resources, and it will also be uploaded onto RCDMS. That is our new management system. So you can go and have a look at the recording at your own time. If you were unclear about something and you just wanted to refresh on a few concepts or a specific concept, you can go back to that video. Lastly, I would like to emphasize that the feedback survey will be posted in the chat section, and this is basically to understand whether this workshop was useful and how we can improve in the future. Also, kindly note that by filling out the survey, it ensures that you receive your certificate of attendance. So before diving in, I just wanted to speak a little bit about the RCD management system. And I'm not too sure if you know about it or if you've heard about it, but it's basically our new management system, and it's basically to streamline your research journey. You can register by logging onto Ulink, you navigate and click on the Services tab and navigate to and click on the RCDMS tab, and then you will be registered. Um, Something to note for registration, you would need to register using your UJ email address. That is when it will allow you to register for all of the workshops. And secondly, you'd need to have a soft copy of your proof of registration, because when you register, they do ask you to upload the proof of registration. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter, Miss Ragi Bashonga. She's a lecturer in the sociology department here at the University of Johannesburg, and she's also a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town. Her research delves into the multifaceted concepts of home, belonging, and Africanity, employing a unique approach that bridges the gap between academic rigor and lived experience. She leverages the evocative power of storytelling and poetry to illuminate complex realities in what she terms poetic portraiture. Ms. Ragi is an alumnus of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute. Her research experience spans over 7 years, encompassing roles such as a researcher at the Human Sciences Research Council, the National Department of Social Development, and a policy researcher at the Isandla Institute. She has also served as a youth representative to the United Nations for the International Sociological Association and was recognized as one of the brightest young minds in Africa in 2017. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to our presenter, Ms. Ragi.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation with you all. It's also quite nice to have a small workshop because that means we get to talk a little bit more. So, thank you, RCD, for the opportunity to present today. And I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are audible. I can also see you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I am just at the office, so there might be a little bit of background noise. So just let me know if you are struggling to hear me so that I can repeat myself.
I will definitely let you know, but for now, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to start off by sharing my slides.
All right.
Are my
Okay,
slides
perfect.
visible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for the very kind introduction. As mentioned, my name is Ragi Bashonga, and I'm a lecturer at the Department of Sociology. And I'll be talking today about the concepts of qualitative research, focusing on a few of the core ideas behind it, some approaches and applications. So I'm not planning on doing a really deep dive today, but I just want to do like a basic introduction to different concepts and ideas. And in doing this, I'm hoping to also introduce you to new ideas and perhaps provoke you into different ways to thinking about qualitative research. So, just a little bit about me before I hear from the people in the room who is here. As mentioned in my bio, I am really interested in how storytelling and poetry can illuminate what we know about people's lived experiences. And that, of course, really cements me into qualitative research, right? So I really want to know about the how, the way, the why of people's lives. And I do this in order to understand mostly ideas around identity politics as they relate to gender, migration, questions of belonging and identity. One of the things I often say to my students and to some of my colleagues and friends is that researchers wear their hearts on their sleeve. So when you look at a lot of work that researchers do and that academics do, you can already get some insight about us. So a lot of the work that I have done speaks to experiences of Black women or Black women in universities, but I also am really interested in questions of migration because I myself am a second generation immigrant in South Africa, and I've really wrestled a lot with what it means to grow up in a different country, to wrestle with questions of identity and belonging, especially in contexts of, what has been termed as xenophobia and Afrophobia. So those are the big questions that come to mind, and that's what pushes and drives my own research agenda. So where I want to start the conversation today is just going around the room and knowing who is here with me and just hearing what your research interests are. And that will also like set a bit of the tone on what we are going to be doing today in the session. So, if I could have some assistance from RCD just to
Yes.
like go around and have people introduce themselves and just, yeah, name the department they're in and what their research interests are.
Okay, perfect. I've allowed all mics, so participants, you can unmute from your side and introduce yourself, your name, and which department you're from. Okay, we've got
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
yes, you can go ahead.
Oh, my name is Tanya Mabika. I'm from the Department of Sociology, and my research interests are, let's just say, extended degree programs.
Okay.
Okay.
So you're interested in studying how people study?
No, 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 no. The role of foundation modules in extended degree programs.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Um, Anybody else? I see that Lawrence and Francis they've typed their names in the chat. Can you let us know which department you're from?
Your department and your research interests, please. So if I can just add, like part of the reason why I want you to unmute your mic if you're able to, is because it's a really useful skill, especially as a qualitative researcher, to practice being able to speak through your research, learning how to communicate to others what it is that you're doing and what it is that you want to find out, just so that you're able to bring in people into your conversation and make sure that you understand others and are also being understood. So you can, of course, type in the chat box, but part of this engagement has to do with just speaking as well.
Good afternoon. Am I audible enough?
Yes, I can
Yes,
hear
you
you.
are.
Okay, Lawrence here, from the School of Public Management and Governance and Public Policy, master student, research interest, good governance and economic development. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
good
Lawrence.
governance. Thank you.
Okay,
Anyone else?
in the chat, we've got Gloria, and she's in the Department of Education. I'm interested in augmented reality in science education.
Okay, interested.
We've got a few more people typing in the chat.
Okay, so you'll just let me know as they come in.
I definitely will. If anybody else wants to unmute and speak,
Mm,
they're free to do so. All right.
okay.
Francis, we've got Francis in the chat says he's a PhD student from the Department of Mathematics, Science, and Technology Education, and his
Mm,
interest is in educational technologies.
thank you so much.
All right, I think you can go ahead and I will let you know if anything else pops up on the chat.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm really happy to see that we've got such a broad array of fields, right? So we have people from mathematics, education, public management, sociology, and that means that you've been introduced to different kinds of methods, maybe not so much in depth, but as a master's student, you have had some introduction, and there are some conventions in your field already, right? So, in doing your research, I want you to always think back to what tricks do you already have up your sleeve? Meaning, what are you already comfortable doing? What do you know typically happens in your field and in your department? And what are the areas that you can build from already? Okay. So I know that if you're in mathematics, for example, you're a numbers person, you're probably a little bit more familiar with doing surveys. And, this is about qualitative approaches. So, what you'd be interested in is looking at actually understanding in depth what it is that people experience in education, right? So, just to start us off, I want to do a bit of an exercise where we look at. Oh, I think I might need to stop sharing altogether and share a new screen.
Okay. In the meantime, I can just tell you, we've got Tando Sibeko. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And Tando is from the CAM department. My research interest is queer representation in film and television and how
Nice.
filmmakers can employ subversive storytelling techniques to challenge societal norms about gender and sexuality. We
Nice.
have Dumasani, who's also he's a PhD student from the Faculty of Education. His research interest is indigenous knowledge systems in mathematics education.
Interesting. Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm loving these research topics, and I think I have a few little nuggets for everyone. But I just want to start us off with a Mentimeter. If you could all just pull out your phone or whatever device you're logging on with and go to menti.com, and then insert this code 22113069. And I just want to hear from you, like when you think about qualitative research, what is it that comes to mind? What do you think qualitative research is about? So as you respond, your answers should be popping up on the screen. Please just let me know as well if you're struggling.
On my side, it's saying code not found.
It's saying code not found.
Yes.
Is anyone else experiencing the same issue?
It worked now. It worked.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Tanya. So it doesn't need to be a long response. You can just give me, some keywords that stand out for you. Just let me know when you think about qualitative research, what do you imagine this is about? Or even what are you hoping that we explore in today's session? Okay, descriptive data, absolutely. So by descriptive data, we mean data that is actually able to describe what is happening in terms of the phenomenon that we're exploring. So it gives you much more than just like a statistic or numerical data. It's going in depth to help describe and help us understand what is happening. Interviews, so that's about the methods that we use, textual analysis, that's also data analysis methods, observations, so what it is that we see with our eyes and how it is that we make sense of what we see, transcription, okay, in-depth information, deeper insights, yes. Okay, so all of these are absolutely correct. And that is what I'm hoping we can explore a little bit more. Sorry, I just went back and shared the wrong thing. Just give me 1 minute.
No problem. Perfect. I can see your slides.
You can see my slides. Okay, great. Ooh. Okay. So part of knowing when, as we've just described, right? Qualitative research is really about unearthing some rich data that will give you a good description and a good understanding of the phenomenon that you are exploring, right? But how do you know that using a qualitative approach is right for your study? So the questions I'm asking today, right, has to do with what is it that should guide your research approach? How would you know that a qualitative study is correct for you? And the one thing is you need to be guided by your research question. So when you look at your research question, right, what is it that you are trying to find out? So I'm wondering, is there anybody in the room who wants to volunteer their research question, if you've developed one?
You can go ahead and unmute, or you can pop your pop it in the chat box, your research question.
Okay, so I'm just going to think about some of the topics that we have here, right? So if we are thinking about indigenous knowledge in mathematics, for example. So when you think about mathematics, we're usually thinking we're playing a numbers game here. But what I'm picking up from this research, the general research topic, is that the student, I think this is Dumisani, the student is interested in knowing, like, what is it about indigenous knowledge systems that explore, unpack something about mathematics. So that's not a how many question, right? or how much or to what extent. What Dumisani is asking is how and what questions. So he's trying to go in depth about what it is that people know. So this could be one of the reasons why you would explore a qualitative research method, right? It's guided by the question. If I'm to pick up on another one,
Sorry, sorry, Miss Reg. There is
yes.
comments in the chat. Gloria's question is, what are the affordances of augmented reality in science education? And then, do you want to do that one first, and then I'll say the next?
Yes, so
Okay.
it's what are the affordances of augmented reality in science education?
Yes.
Okay, so what do you mean by affordances? If you would be if you would be bold, Gloria, and talk back to me. So another big thing, Gloria, as you are typing or if you're going to unmute yourself, another big thing you need to think about as you're doing qualitative research, right, is using the kind of language that would be accessible to the people that you're talking to. So if you're speaking to students or if you're speaking to lecturers or the general public, you want to use the kind of language that your audience would be familiar with. So affordances, for example, could mean a range of things. It could mean money, it could mean like social resources. So I'd need to be quite clear around what is it that you're actually looking at, right?
So she typed back to say advantages.
So what are the advantages? Okay, so I think that would be a really nice way to maybe rephrase your question. What are the advantages? But drawing to how you phrased that question, right? You're asking a what question. What are the advantages? So you're asking us to explore something in depth, right? The advantages are not necessarily something that you want to count, even though you could go for an approach where you perhaps give your respondents a range of options and you tally up to get a sense of what would be the maybe the more frequent response. But it seems to me that you're trying to go into in depth and understand ideas around advantages and disadvantages of, affordances is what you're looking at. Okay. Do you have any other research questions in the chat box?
Yes, Sibeko's question is how Callie Torres and Arizona Robbins' relationship in the series Grey's Anatomy subverts heteronormative tropes.
Nice. Okay, so you are looking at this is a series, Grey's Anatomy, right?
Yes, it's a
Yes,
medical
a medical
drama,
a medical drama, a really good one.
and we all want to be doctors after that one.
So once again, that's a really good qualitative research question, right? Because you're not looking at the series and trying to count up, for example, how often they are affectionate, right? You're looking at, okay, what is it that the film or the series rather helps you understand about gendered tropes or tropes around sexuality. So that's going really in depth in terms of people's understandings, or rather how things are projected in film and in media. So are there any more questions that were given in the chat box?
No, not at this time.
Not at this time. Okay. So the points I'm trying to drive
Oh,
here,
sorry. I'm so sorry.
here's another one. No, it's
Yes.
fine.
It's Michael, and he says, what is the effect of foreign debt servicing on service provision in Kenya?
What is the effect of foreign debt servicing?
Yes, on service provision in Kenya.
Okay, all right. So that's a really interesting one as well, because just listening to that question, I can see how it would lend itself quite well to a mixed approach as well. Because when you're talking about servicing debt, this is something where you'd have like a lot of numerical data to back up what is actually happening in the context of Kenya, but you'd also want to hear something about the lived experiences or the realities of people, whether they're working in the national banks with the loans or just people on the ground as well, if we are to think about the protests that have been happening in Kenya over the past year. Right? So you really need to be guided by your research question as well as your research objectives. So, what is it that you're hoping your research will do? Right? So, beyond the paper, what are you hoping that your research will do? And what kind of data do you need in order to do that research? The second point I have is also understanding the conventions of your field, right? So, whether you are in sociology, public management, education, it's really important that you immerse yourself in understanding what the conventions of your field are. So, typically, what would someone in your faculty, in your department, how would they approach the work? What has been done in terms of these kind of studies in the past? And what can you learn from these conventions, right? So, in doing this, it's similar to how you would typically do a kind of literature review. So, when we are doing a literature review, we're trying to understand what is known about our research topic already. So you go into in-depth reading about what is known, trying to understand the field, but also trying to unpack what we typically call the gaps, right? I prefer to think about it in terms of points of interest because it's not just about trying to see what has not been done, but also trying to incite a curiosity in yourself about what could be or what you want to know more about, not necessarily something that is completely absent. But I want you to think about methodology in a similar way that you think about literature review, right? When you are reading different journal articles or book chapters or exploring like research that has been done in the past, think about what people are typically doing. Are they typically doing interviews? Um, do they have conversations with people? Are they doing surveys and telling up numbers? And this will give you an idea as to the reasons why they use these conventions, but also perhaps open up a gap for you to do something different. And that's really important, right? So think about what has been done and what are the spaces that are opening up for you when you see what has been done already. But also conventions help to give us direction. They help have a model that you can perhaps copy or emulate from in developing your own research questions. Okay, so finally, the 2 points that I'm bringing here lead up to the point around what is it that doing qualitative research can help open up in your research agenda. And I'm using open very deliberately because, as we stated earlier, qualitative research is about getting really rich, in depth data. So you want questions that are open, that open up the space rather than box people into particular fixed ideas. So, in doing that, I want you to also think carefully about how it is that you, as the person conducting the research, shows up in the space. What is it that your research instruments do in the space, right? Is your research instrument deliberately designed in a way that will open up questions, or does it close and box people down? So, in the same way that I brought up, the conversation around the words that you use, the terminology, these are really important things that you constantly need to have in the back of your mind that your methods and your tools are open enough for the conversation, that they're not intimidating, that they also are not leading people into particular responses. Okay. Do I have any questions or comments so far?
Not at the moment, but if you want to pause and maybe allow for 1 or 2 minutes if anybody wants to clarify something, or yeah, we can do that.
Okay. I absolutely want to do that.
All right. Okay, nobody at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just move on. Okay. So here I just have a slide to reiterate, right, the key differences between our quantitative and qualitative approaches. So whereas quantitative approaches are thought of as quite positivistic, um, I think of qualitative data as something that is more interpretive, right? So, with your quantitative approaches, you are looking at things that are measurable, that you can count, that give you a kind of index around where your particular phenomenon lies. It's questions that tell you how often, how much, right? Whereas if you're looking at qualitative data, you're more interested in people's lived experiences or in the realities relating to words and language and what people are thinking, feeling, and understanding. So the questions move from how much or how often into exploring why, how, right? Going deeper into understanding the dynamics that are at play in the particular research that you're exploring. And so another thing is that quantitative data tends to be fixed on trying to understand, let me say, a hard truth. I put that in inverted commas because that is something that can be debated as well. They say they're interested in facts, whereas with qualitative data, you're looking for something that is more dynamic, right? That is subjective, that is open to interpretation. So it's the interpretation of your participants about their realities or the context that you're exploring. But also, an important thing for you to think about is how the data is also subject to your own interpretations. So, as the person working with the data and as the person creating the instruments with which you collect the data, your own interpretations and your own biases become real in the instruments that you're creating, in the way that you hold the conversations, right? So it's really important for you to be reflexive in your research process. Um, are you guys familiar with that term, the term around reflexivity?
Personally, no.
Okay. Anyone else?
Gloria also says no.
No. Okay, so maybe this is a good place for us to pause, right? So I'd like to talk about reflexivity because this is really important when you're doing qualitative research. I'm going to bring up two words, reflexivity and positionality. So reflexivity has to do with reflecting on your research process and being quite detailed in making sure that the data that you obtain is reliable. And because we are saying that qualitative data is quite a subjective and an interpretivist process, right? Part of your reflection has to do with sitting down and thinking about what kind of biases you bring into the research space. So, if you would allow me, I want to maybe talk to Tando since you brought your research question up earlier. If if you were to think about what got you interested in Grey's Anatomy, and how that could perhaps affect your research question. Do you have some ideas around that? Like, do you come into the research thinking that perhaps there weren't enough representation of queer people in the show?
Not necessarily that there wasn't enough, but they were kind of subjected to heteronormative tropes mirroring heterosexual relationships in some kind of way. And they were only representing female relationships,
Mhm,
women loving women relationships more than.
mhm. Okay, so from what I was able to pick up, you're saying that okay, there's something about the representation, so not necessarily that queer people were excluded, but when they were represented, there was generally a lot of like women loving on women relationships, right? So you need to reflect on the fact that this is what you observed watching the series. And perhaps I don't know what your particular methodology is, whether you're just looking at the film or you want to talk to other people who have watched the film. But in working through your tool, part of being reflective is thinking about, okay, what is the perspective that I'm coming into this research with already? No. So, what am I coming in with already? What am I expecting to find? And how is that influencing how I am developing my tools? Right. So, it helps you bring your biases to the fore and also what you can also do to show the person who is reading your research paper or marking your dissertation that you are being rigorous with the data is bringing that to the fore, saying that okay, my understanding of the film was this, and it informed the way that I developed my tools in particular ways, right? So it shows that you recognize that it's a subjective process and that you are open to like different perspectives that may come in. Because when you are not forthcoming about your own biases or your own perspectives, it's easy to lose sight of what they actually are and not see when they begin to interfere with your research. Okay. So, for example, let me see. If we are to talk about Lawrence, for example, around good governance and economic development. Perhaps there's a particular lens with which you understand what good governance is. So it could be rooted in a particular understanding of governance or a context that you come from, but this may be different from how someone in a different context understands it. So when you're reflective, you basically think about your own positionality, and I'm going to unpack what that term means as well in the process of how it is that you come, first of all, to your research question, but also how it is that you develop your particular research tools. So, if I can just speak to the idea around positionality for a minute. Positionality has to do with your own position or social location in the world. So, it has to do with taking a look at yourself, what your own research interests are, what your own lived experiences are, and how that could come and affect your research. So, for example, if I was a white woman doing research on the experiences of Black men in the township, it would be helpful to the person who is reading the research to understand that I, for one, am a white woman who has had different experiences to the people that I'm researching. Different lived experiences come from a different social and cultural context. Okay. and note how that may affect the research in particular ways. Or in my own context, as someone who's done research on the experiences of migration, I started off by talking about how I myself am a Congolese immigrant and I've experienced xenophobia in particular ways, so that the person reading my research understands that there's a certain lens with which I come into the interview process or the research process with. Okay, so that just helps you also be a lot more rigorous and also analyze yourself in relation to your research participants. In that way, you approach your research as a constantly dynamic process. So you're not just going into the field as a 1 or 2 time event, but constantly as you are working through your qualitative research approach, you are taking time at different moments to ask even yourself the why and the how questions. Okay, do I have any questions about this point on reflexivity and positionality at this point?
Um,
Or is it clear?
we've just
I think
got,
even thumbs would be great.
yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I think the point around the positionality and reflexivity is also important when you think about your data collection, which is here at point number 4, when you say that we're gathering data through observations and interviews, for example. I'll unpack more data collection methods in a minute, but your own positionality and your reflections help you in this data collection process, right? So whereas when you are just counting how many people attended a particular school or how many people have used augmented reality as part of the learning process, that is different from watching someone use augmented reality, for example, or speaking to people about their experiences of using augmented reality or using technology in learning. But also your own um, reflections on your process and on your motivations for the research really help in making sure that you're coming up with quality questions, that you are being thoughtful about the tools that you are using, and that you are recognizing that this is not just a numbers game, that you are interpreting your own position as well as the position of your research participants. Okay. So even in the analyzing of the data, with quantitative data, you're typically using a software, going through a process of statistical analysis. But with qualitative data, it's usually a much more dynamic process. You're usually working through like a kind of thematic analysis or a content analysis to come up with themes and categories that help you understand what people have been talking to you and explaining about. Okay. So I'm going to speak a bit about different approaches to research, and then we'll do an activity just to make sure that we understand based on our understanding of these more conventional qualitative approaches, how and where to use them, and perhaps give you some ideas about approaches you can use in your own work. Okay. So for most of us who have been exposed to some kind of qualitative research, you would more typically be familiar with doing research using interviews. So this is when you have an interview schedule where you are asking open-ended questions. Conversations also tend to form part of this interview process. So you're coming in to the conversation with a written agenda, written out questions, open-ended. Once again, the phrasing of the questions is important, but you're trying to basically hear from a participant what their thoughts or ideas on a particular topic is, right? The second approach has to do with focus groups. So that's when you have a more moderated group discussion. You typically bring in people who have either based on similarities or differences, and you are trying to get a conversation going about your topic. Okay, so in a focus group discussion, you tend to try to keep it into a small space, but you want to hear that when people hear others' ideas, right? What is it that they bring into the conversation more? Or also sometimes some topics are easier to unpack when they discuss it with others. So when you are doing focus groups, you need to like have a lot of things in mind, thinking about whether it's actually relevant for the kind of questions that you're asking in the research process, but also thinking about like the sensitivity of the topic, right? If you are asking deeply personal questions, for example, around people's sexuality or sexual experiences, a focus group might not necessarily be the correct forum or the correct kind of approach for your research. But if maybe your research is something along the lines of what Tanya is doing, where she's exploring extended degree programs, perhaps it would be good to have people in different or the same extended degree program in the same room unpacking these questions, right? So hearing someone else's experience might jar you to think about your own experience in new ways, or maybe, just help people open up a bit more. But focus groups also require you to have a particular skill in conducting them. So, you know that typically when you're in like a group situation, you may have one or two people who tend to hog the conversation a little bit. So you need to think about, okay, what skills do I have at my disposal to facilitate the conversation in such a way that I hear different voices and I get different perspectives, which is the core motivation of having a focus group discussion. Okay. And then the next method we have is phenomenology, and that is interested in getting an in-depth understanding of people's lived experiences. So it differs from an interview in that you tend to let the person guide you into their own life. So whereas with an interview question, you kind of come in with almost a set of agendas around what it is that you want to ask, how it is that you want to unpack it. When you use phenomenology, you are trying to root it in people's lived experiences. And obviously, the person you are talking to knows more about their lived experience than you do. So you let them guide the conversation a bit more. You try to look not only at the conversation, but also look at the environment around that can help give you insight into what is happening in their world, right? So observation comes into phenomenology as well. Okay. Moving on to ethnography. Ethnography has quite a deep, conflicting, troubling history when you think about it in terms of the discipline has left my mind. Anthropology, and the problematics of anthropology as a discipline, right? When you think about how anthropology was introduced, who introduced it, and the fact that it was typically approached from quite an imperialist and Western gaze. But ethnography is in the process of being reformed, and people use this method in different ways. But ethnography has to do with like a deep immersion into a particular culture or into a particular group. So it has to do with forming part of that group or, following them and trying to understand the group or the culture in order for you to speak to the realities of that world. So that's when you'd use an ethnographic approach. Another approach tied to ethnography is the autoethnography. So that's when you use yourself as as part of the research approach. So you look at yourself as a member of a particular group or a particular culture and use that as a point of entry into understanding that group. So an autoethnographic study would be maybe studying your own position as, let's say, a Kenyan person, and using that as a way to understand what good governance would look like. So saying that in my particular cultural group in Kenya, for example, we understand governance to work in this way. And if we are to approach it from here, this is how it would inform theory or data collection, right? So situating the self at the core of this qualitative approach. So that's what autoethnography does. And then there's grounded theory, where you develop, the aim of the approach is to develop theory from your data. So in the previous approaches that I've mentioned, you're coming in with particular theories that you would have developed in your process of conducting a literature review, for example. So you are coming in, your interview questionnaire, for example, would have been developed from the understanding you've gotten through your process of literature review, what you're expecting to find in the field, or also from your own positionality, your own understanding of the world. But when you come in using grounded theory as your qualitative approach, you're saying that I want to go into the field and let the data that is captured in the field guide the theory that I will develop as a way of understanding the approaches, the experiences that come out. Okay. So grounded theory is about developing a theory from the ground. And then the case study approach is one that we've mostly been exposed to, I think, in high school as well, where you look at one particular case in depth and you try to have a thorough understanding of that one particular case. So this could be, for example, understanding how Baragwanath Hospital has handled cases of ARV dis dispensation over the past year, right? So it's going in depth into one particular case and from there trying to draw particular conclusions. And then narrative research, it has more to do with understanding particular stories. So whether you are looking at autobiographies or film, or even looking at data from a particular institute, whether it's a finance bureau, for example, and you're looking at it from the perspective of understanding the story of the institution or the story of individuals, right? You're looking at how the narrative drives your understanding of the research and the conclusions that you reach. Okay, so these are the more conventional research approaches that people have been using in the field to date. Any
Uh,
questions at this
Ye
point?
yes. There is a question in the chat. Please explain the difference between uh, phenomenology and case study.
Okay, so with phenomenology, quite a tongue twister, you are basically interested in people's lived experiences. So, using a phenomenological approach, you're not necessarily just speaking to one or two individuals. You could have a number of people part of your research, and you're trying to get an in-depth understanding on what their lived experience of a particular thing is. So, if I can use an example, if you want to understand, for example, how people experienced living through the COVID pandemic, using phenomenology would be a good approach, right? So you'd talk to them about From the moment you found out about lockdown, what was your experience? Where did you live? And then let them guide you into the reality of their lives. So they'd probably tell you a little bit about where they were during lockdown, if they ever contracted COVID, if they ever lost anyone to COVID, right? So their experience is guiding the research process for you and helping you develop your questions in the moment as well. So you're focusing on their lived experience, and it's not necessarily just one person that you're looking at. It could be a number of people, and that helps you reach the particular conclusions that you do. Whereas with the case study approach, a case study means you are looking deeply at one or two examples. So let's say you're looking at COVID-19, the case of Montana Hospital. So you are going in depth into understanding how Montana Hospital handled the COVID-19 pandemic. So rather than getting a number of different perspectives and lived experiences, you come in with a particular set of ideas to start off with, and this helps you go in depth. So with qualitative research, I need to stress that it is a dynamic process. So it's never wise to just have your set of 10 questions and want to stick to those 10 questions. You do need to let the research process unfold. But the key difference here is that with a case study, you're looking in depth into one particular case and you're using that to make particular conclusions or deductions. I see I have a
Okay.
question from
Yeah.
Michael.
Yes. Michael, you can unmute and go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted a bit of clarification. In the previous slide, there was that difference. Yes, this one. I think the fourth, the third in the list, where you're saying qualitative is factual and qualitative is subjective. I don't know in terms of the terminology. So does this imply that what you get out of qualitative research is not factual?
Okay, so thanks for that question, Michael. You'll notice that factual here is in inverted commas, right? Because I'm trying to problematize the term. So just because you counted something or you got quantitative data, you got people to fill out a survey, and you're not necessarily interpreting it using a subjective lens, doesn't mean that it is necessarily a universal truth. Because even in the formation of like a quantitative survey, there are biases that are embedded in that tool itself. And there's also like limitations to how people understand it or how much they are actually able to say in their response to that question. So when I say that qualitative data is subjective or open to interpretation, what I'm saying is that we recognize embedded in this approach that there are multiple interpretations and multiple truths, and that in presenting this research, we try to make our audience aware of that. So in how I was speaking about reflexivity, positionality, being clear about how it is that you are going about the process of interpreting the data and how you ask particular questions, it helps to make it more evident how you reached the particular conclusions that you did, right? It's also recognizing that because with qualitative data, you're speaking about people, people's lives, people's contexts. It's not necessarily going to be the same in one context and the other, right? For example, people who lived through COVID-19 in a rural area and in the city did not have the same experience, even though they experienced the same COVID-19, right? So it's understanding that there's an interpretation and also differences in context and in realities that we are bringing to the fore, that we are making more evident. So, with quantitative researchers, they tend to think about the work they're doing as factual or as truth because they counted or tallied it up. But we're saying that that's not necessarily the case. Just because you counted or used the quantitative approach doesn't mean that it's universal. It doesn't mean that it's fixed or that it's necessarily true in the way that we understand truth as something fixed. But with a qualitative approach, you are stressing the fact that this is dynamic, that it's subjective, that you're looking at the interpretations of your participants, but also your own interpretation of their roles and their realities. Okay, so you're just making the subjectivities a lot more evident than you would with quantitative data. I hope that answers your question, Michael, or would you like me to unpack it a bit further?
No, sure, thanks. It does.
Okay. Do I have any more questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Excellent. So at this point, I'd like us to go back to our Mentimeter, and I want us to do a few exercises that I hope will also help you decide on what would be some good approaches to use for your own research. It's like a practical application of figuring out what approach would work for what kind of study. Okay. So please go back to the Mentimeter, and then we are going to answer this first question. So I'm doing a multiple choice quiz. And the first question is, a researcher lives with an indigenous community for 6 months, participating in daily life to understand their cultural practices. What kind of qualitative approach would this be? Is it ethnography, phenomenology, or grounded theory? So you just need to select what you think is the correct answer on the Mentimeter. Are you all able to access the Mentimeter?
You can let us know if you're experiencing any difficulties. You can chat, pop your difficulty or query in the chat box or unmute and speak.
So I'll give it another 2 minutes.
All
So just
right.
remember, yeah.
Um, there, there's several people that require the code for the Mentimeter.
Oh, is it not? Sorry, I thought I was sharing my screen. Can you not see my screen for the Mentimeter?
No.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. Switching between screens is a bit tricky.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Okay, can you all see the Mentimeter?
I can. Can everybody give me a thumbs up?
Okay, so it's the same code. It's 22113069. Okay, I'll give it another minute. I hope you're all able to at least see the Menti now.
They should be.
Okay, so I just had 3 people respond. Please respond, guys. It really helps to know if you're understanding the concepts, like if you'll allow me, if you'll allow me just to say that, part of a workshop is the idea of workshopping, right? So workshopping has to do with being able to practically speak or work on something together so that, me as the facilitator also gets a sense of whether you are really catching on to the concepts, and it gives you an opportunity to practice, right? Rather than just listening. So please do participate in the mentees. It just helps give us all a sense of where we are and if we all understand what's happening. Okay, so with this question, the correct answer is ethnography. And the reason is because the researcher goes and lives with the indigenous community. They participate in daily life and they are trying to understand cultural practices, right? So remember, I said that ethnography is about understanding particular cultures or groups, but it's also an immersion into that culture. So it's forming part of it in order to understand it. Okay. The reason it's not phenomenology and why it could easily be, you could easily misunderstand that this could be, is because of this idea of daily life. Right. So with phenomenology, like I said, you're trying to understand people's lived experiences. And of course, this approach would help you understand the lived experiences, except the difference here is that the researcher forms part of the community. So with phenomenology, you're not necessarily forming part of their community or their group or their world. You're just trying to hear from the participant. With ethnography, you are immersing yourself into that culture or into that group. Okay, so the next one is a study aims to develop a theory about how postgraduate students cope with academic stress by analyzing interview data. So it's the same code. I think you just need to swipe to the next slide. So would this be an example of a case study, grounded theory, or a narrative? So I'll give this 2 minutes as well. I'm just going to read the question again. Study aims to develop a theory about how postgraduate students cope with academic stress by analyzing interview data. Would this be an example of a case study, grounded theory, or narrative approach? Okay, so I see we have 2 people who said case study and one who says grounded theory. Okay, so the reason this is grounded theory, the correct answer is grounded theory, is because the study is aiming to develop a theory based on the interview data. So the data is the starting point for the theory to develop. So grounded theory is about using the data you collect in the field to help you understand the phenomenon at play and develop a theory about it. Okay. So the reason you would have maybe thought it's a case study is because, we're saying we're looking at postgraduate students. So it could be postgraduate students at a particular university, even though I didn't say that. So remember, a case study focuses or zooms in on one particular case, whether it's an organization or even a person, a biography. That could also be a form of a case study, depending on how you make the argument for it. But the key thing here is that they are aiming to develop a theory based on the interview data. So the interview data is the ground or the starting point for the developing of this theory. So remember, when I started the conversation, what I was saying is that it's really important for you to keep in mind that your research question and your research objectives will determine the kind of approach that you use. Okay? The next one is: a researcher collects detailed stories from cancer survivors to explore their lived experience of illness. Is this an example of phenomenology, ethnography, or a case study? So a researcher collects detailed stories from cancer survivors to explore their lived experience of illness. Okay, so this is an example of phenomenology, and the reason is because the studies aimed at understanding the lived experiences of the cancer survivors, right? So the researcher is collecting detailed stories, and what I can make out from this is that the cancer survivors would be the ones directing the conversation, right? So if you can collecting a detailed story from someone, you need to let them actually speak about their lived experience. And this is the core of what phenomenology is about, right? So it would, if you phrase it in particular ways, it could form part of a case study. If, for example, we are looking at cancer survivors at who received treatment at Steve Biko Hospital and maybe wanted to understand something about what the hospital did in order to ensure that their patients survive. That could be a form of a case study. But the key thing in this case is the fact that they are trying to understand the lived experiences of illness. Okay, so collecting the detailed stories for lived experiences forms part of phenomenology, whereas a case study is going really in depth into a particular case to understand what is happening in that context. I think another thing that's worth saying now is that you don't necessarily need to stick to a single approach when you're doing qualitative research. So you could perhaps, if I if I'm going back to this, you could perhaps decide to do phenomenology as well as ethnography. So go live at maybe a children's hospital, or rather immerse yourself into the children's hospital where they are cancer survivors. All right. Form part of that community, but also try to understand their lived experiences in that context. So there you would be merging two different approaches. So when you're doing qualitative research approaches, don't think that it needs to be either or. There are ways for you to really think through how you can merge them based once again on the objectives of your study. So what it is that you want to do and the kind of data that you want to get out. Okay, our next example is as an in-depth investigation of a single rural school's approach to inclusive education, including interviews, observations, and document review. Is this an example of a case study, grounded theory, or narrative? I have two people at case study. Anyone else? Okay, so it is an example of a case study. Well done. So everyone who responded got that one correct because we are focusing on that one single rural schools approach, right? But it's also mm, in the case study, they are also employing like a mixed approaches by using interviews, observations, and document review. So there is an extent to which you could say there's a narrative to it, because if you are exploring documents, you could be trying to understand the narrative, the history of the school, the history of their approaches to, or the story rather of their approaches to inclusive education, doing the interviews, all of that, right? But it's at its core, it's a case study. So it's one of those researchers that would say, maybe call this study Understanding Inclusive Educational Approaches, the case of a rural school in Bumalanga. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go back to my main presentation. Do I have any questions of clarity at this point? Did the exercises help you understand the different approaches a little bit better?
You can unmute and indicate, or you can pop your response in the chat. All right, there's nothing for now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
Okay,
you
so
can
I'll take the silence to mean everyone is on the same page.
definitely.
Okay. So there are also, so I just unpacked, the more conventional approaches to qualitative research, but there's also more unconventional approaches that people use. And I find these quite interesting. I'm personally interested in looking at novel ways to do research and particularly decolonial ways to do research, right? But another thing you should keep in mind is that think about how the world is changing and how, because the world is changing, there are different opportunities available and also different approaches that you can use to conduct your research. So if you are maybe a master's or a PhD student trying to think about, okay, what is my gap? Sometimes your gap can be in the methodology that you use, using a different approach to understand or to research something that has already been researched. But maybe the conventions of your field have done it in a particular way, and you're curious about knowing, will we get similar results if we use a different approach? Or maybe would using a different approach help you unearth new realities, right? Would it resonate with the people that you're talking to in different ways? So, speaking of context, one of the more novel approaches that have been used lately is ethnography. So, this relates to ethnography, except now you are looking at virtual communities. So, for example, support groups that exist online. So, I know a student who did research on mental health support groups that existed online. So, on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and going into these support groups and seeing how it is that they operate, what kind of support do they offer each other, how is it that that community forms a culture around supporting people with mental health challenges, right? So looking at virtual communities. Another thing is considering online interviews or online focus groups. So conducting your research on Zoom or WhatsApp and using that as your method rather than doing face-to-face interviews and face-to-face focus groups as has been the norm. But in doing this, you need to also think carefully about what limitations that introduces to your study, or also what opportunities it opens up to your study. So as you are writing this out in your research, I want you to be very purposeful about thinking about these questions. So for example, if you are to conduct an interview online, one of the limitations could be the extent to which you're actually able to connect with your participants. So I know for a fact, as someone who prefers to do in-person workshops, the way that a workshop operates in person versus online is quite different. So online, people tend to be a bit more quiet. Also, for the person doing the interview, you might feel a little bit more awkward because there isn't the verbal cues or the body language cues that you would typically rely on in an in-person interaction. So it requires you to draw on like a different set of skills in order to have successful online interviews. But then there's also opportunities that it opens up. For example, you could be speaking, let's say you are trying to understand science education at different universities. You wouldn't necessarily be limited to interviewing people at your particular institution or even in your country. If you're doing online interviews, you can now speak to people all over the world, right? Or or maybe like it helps you transverse different time zones. Or if you're talking about a sensitive issue, sometimes having the screen is the buffer that people need in order to tell you realities about their lives that could be difficult to say when we are speaking to people face to face, right? So when you are thinking about choosing a particular methodology or writing in your methodology chapters about what it is that you did in the field, I want you to think about what it is that was opened up or closed off because of the particular research method that you used. Another one is photo voice. So photo voice is a research method by which people take pictures of a particular topic, and that is used as a catalyst for reflection, right? So it kind of ties in a little bit to grounded theory because it's an approach that uses the participant as the core basis for how you develop the questions, for one, and also the kind of theory that will emerge through the pictures that they choose. So, an example of photo voice would be, for example, let's use Tando's study, the one on Grey's Anatomy. If Tando was speaking to different participants who have watched Grey's Anatomy, she could ask them to maybe screenshot a scene that speaks to them or, that resonates with their ideas around queer representation in media. And then from that screenshot, you allow the person to have a conversation about what stands out with them. Okay. Or for example, if you are looking at indigenous knowledge systems in maths and you want to use photo voice as a method, perhaps you would ask people like, okay, in your particular cultural context or in your understanding of indigenous methods, can you take pictures of things that have helped you in your journey of maths education, or how it is that you understand maths as a particular knowledge system in and of itself, right? So it allows the participant to find things in their own context and in their own reality and use that as a way to begin the conversation. So it's meant to be a catalyst for conversation and for reflection. And then lastly, there are various different kinds of art-based approaches, ranging from people painting pictures and having that be part of the conversation. What I used in my own research was storytelling. So I did interviews as well as approaches where I'd make them draw maps or, map out their lives and then write stories based on that. And my participants read those stories and gave me feedback about the stories, which were later turned into poems, right? So think about what is it that you could do differently in qualitative research that is so open and so broad and allows you to merge different approaches that will help you bring something unique and creative to the research that you're doing. Okay. Any questions and comments here? I'm going to pause for a second. Also, to just have a sip and clear my throat.
Okay. All right, attendees, you can either, oh, there we go. Go ahead with your question. You can.
Hi everyone. I just want to confirm with a photo voice approach. Let's say, for example, I'm working on a project that has to do with orientation week,
Yes.
and I want to include observations. Would Because I'm also thinking of ethical considerations. Would you be allowed to sort of take pictures like during such a process, or there's limitations to it?
Yeah, so I think especially if you're thinking of like the PAPIA Act now, right?
Mm.
There's limitations to if you're actually able to take pictures of people, um, consent. So those are part of the things that you need to really think about in your research process. So when you're thinking about your methodology, think about the ethical questions that emerge as part of it. So typically, what you could do with like a scenario where you're doing this orientation week, you could perhaps think of spaces rather than people. So taking a picture of the hall where they hold the speeches for orientation week, and maybe you take or you ask your participants to take pictures of spaces that they felt either facilitated the orientation week process or held it back. So maybe they could take a picture of the hall and say that, okay, the hall made them feel like the space was too big, or it didn't feel warm enough, or perhaps take pictures of the different stalls and say that these stalls were an opportunity for me to engage the different departments. You see, so that's how it works. And then just think about the ethical considerations and also the permissions that you need. So maybe if you are to take pictures at UJ, you might need to ask for institutional permission. If you are taking pictures here, so it really depends, and your supervisors and the institution is able to guide you a little bit. But if you are doing research on maybe people's experiences living in the city, they could maybe take a picture of heavy traffic, right? Or take a picture of um, people sitting alone at a coffee shop, maybe just the back of people and not their actual faces, and have that as a way for you to engage the conversation. Or even if someone does take a picture of someone's face, it's a matter of getting consent to use the picture, or just rather than including the direct photo, putting in a description of the photo in your research rather than the photo itself. Okay, so think about creative ways to go about displaying this, but photo voice is quite a powerful qualitative approach. I hope I answered your question, B. Do I have any more questions?
B responds saying interesting.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, feel free to jump in if you do have anything you want to add. So I'm gonna move on to something that is close to my heart, and this is around like decolonial approaches to qualitative research. So the approaches that I've shared with you are either conventional in the sense that, typically in the social sciences and humanities, these are the approaches that academics and researchers use for various studies, or unconventional but have been used, quite broadly, especially in the global north. But I also want you to think in your work as scholars and scholars that are located in the global south and in Africa, think about what approaches to qualitative research can be decolonial and speak a lot closely to the context that you find yourself in, right? And this has to do with like the ethical approaches that you use, but also like the methods, right? And the ways of conducting research that actually speaks to the people you are talking to. If I can just reflect a little bit on this, and in my experience of doing research in various communities when I worked as a researcher at different organizations. Thinking back, there are often times that I wish we would have done things differently and in a way that speaks to the realities that people find themselves in. So, for example, um, there was a project that I was a part of where we went into rural areas and spoke to communities that were struggling with water. So we'd go house to house and ask them about their experiences of not having water, because most of these communities had no water or had water tanks that would come in once a week or sometimes even quite irregularly. And part of what research institutes typically include as part of the ethics is that you can't give people money for participating in your study because that compromises the data. But when you think about what it means to have Ubuntu for one, or to see people struggling and come into their community as an organization or as a person with particular resources and say that you're unable to help because the ethics that were determined in a Western context say that you can't help, right? Or that it would compromise your research. It has particular meanings for the decolonial agenda, and it doesn't necessarily speak to the context and the realities we find ourselves in. So in doing your work, I want you to also begin to think about these things, like think about like the research and the ethics that are taken for granted and how these can be challenged. And these are some of the scholars that I look to in thinking about decolonizing research methodologies or centering ways of knowing, ways of understanding the world that are rooted in the context of Africa and the context of the global South, right? Rather than just amplifying Eurocentric voices. And some of these perspectives from decolonial scholars are included in this slide, which I just want to talk you through and help you understand the logics thereof. And you can decide whether this makes sense for the research that you are doing. So the one is the decolonization of research. And being at UJ, especially over the past decade, a year after fees must fall and decolonize the academy, I'm sure you've become quite familiar with the idea of decolonization. And at its core is challenging Western dominance, Western ways of knowing, and amplifying indigenous perspectives. So I see that you already have people who are thinking in that terms. I mean, Dumisani mentioned that he's interested in indigenous knowledge as it relates to mathematics. So looking at what is it about our own contexts and our own ways of knowing can we introduce into the academy into a way that also speaks to the people that are giving us this knowledge, right? So not trying to make it fit into the box of what counts as knowledge in the academy, but making a case for how they present their knowledge. Also thinking about research as part of a transformative agenda. So using your research as a tool for social justice. So not just knowing for the sake of knowing or doing research that won't necessarily change people's lives, but making it part of your research process to conduct research as a tool for emancipation. So to think about if, for example, I'm looking at extended degree programs, how is it that I hope my research will be able to transform the way that extended degree programs are framed so that we are able to achieve social justice or equality? So that's thinking about perhaps the different barriers to education that people in extended degree programs faced, being in the system for longer than a conventional degree. This costs something for people's resources, right? So thinking about what is it about people's realities, and what comes out of this research that can help me push an agenda for social justice. And then there's also the question of ethical partnerships. So you'll know that typically when we conduct research, it is your name that is going to appear on the research report, on your dissertation or your thesis, or if you go on to publish the research in the different journal articles and the book chapters, whatever it is that you end up producing. But think about the ethics of people perhaps giving you the knowledge that they have. If maybe, for example, Dumisani, you think about the fact that someone introduced you to different indigenous knowledge systems that they know or they developed, but you are the one who gets to get a degree out of it and your name alone appears. So how is it that you can go into research in a way that is ethical and allows for co-creation, for them to have a sense of ownership and a sense of credit for the work that they have given you? A simple way to think about it as well is how, generally when we are doing our ethics, we say things like, oh, I'm going to uphold anonymity and confidentiality. But maybe being anonymous is not what your particular participant needs. So if someone is giving you information on perhaps how to do augmented reality better than what is done in universities at the present moment, and you decide that you're going to use anonymity, you basically erase their name from the process, right? So, in what cases does anonymity serve the participants, and in what cases does it do them a disservice? So, think about these things as you are doing your research. Also, thinking about culturally sensitive methods. So, going into the field, thinking about the methods that resonate with people from those cultures. So if you're saying that you are doing an autoethnographic approach as a person that belongs to a particular culture, and you know that in your culture, you use particular proverbs, you use storytelling in order to understand the world, right? There's a particular way of speaking to elders. How is it that you can use that kind of knowledge and that kind of intuition in your research and present that in a way that does justice to the culture that you are representing? So, not just using like that Western Eurocentric lens, but delving deep into what you know about this world, what you know about the reality of your context, and how to make that come alive. Give it voice, give it the power that it deserves, right? Let it hold space in the academy as well as a valid way of knowing. And then also finally critiquing power relations. So how do we redress power imbalances in the knowledge production system? So for example, the fact that when we go out and you conduct research in a poor community, you get funding, you get a promotion in your job, but the people who you conducted the research on don't necessarily get anything out of that research process. So, how do you wrestle with these questions of power and the question of what is actually derived out of the research process that you can use to make research in itself a much more just and equitable process? Right. So, what are the ethics and what are the approaches that you can use to make the whole research process as decolonial as it can be and as just and as ethical as it can be, keeping in mind the context that you are speaking to? So, that's something that I hold very close to my heart in the research that I do. Would anyone like me to unpack there?
Okay, I think we just have one request in the chat from Dumisani asking if he can have your email address. Maybe you can put it in the chat.
Yes, I'll definitely do that.
Also, I just want to remind you that the workshop is scheduled to end at 3, but we can go a little over.
Okay. All right. I took a little bit of time, but I'm
That's fine.
hoping it's all worthwhile.
Definitely, definitely.
Okay, so we've spoken about the different kinds of data collection already. So in the interest of time, I won't go too much into this, but if you do want to talk to me about your data collection method, I'm happy for you to drop me an email and we can have a chat about it. I also had a role-playing activity which I can go through really quickly, just do one or two examples. If I can just have one volunteer willing to speak to me. If any of you can put their hand up. Nobody at all?
I think people are a little shy. Oh, there we go. Go ahead,
B.
D.
Okay, thank you, P.
It's bad, but I
It's
didn't have
who?
time to type info. Bad. I'll just type it in the chat. My name.
Batsiba.
Yes, bad.
Batsiba. Okay, thank you so
Yes.
much. So I'm going to do a role play activity with you, right? Um, and basically, I want you to choose three of these questions. You'll ask me from scene one and scene two. Maybe start off with scene two, and I just want you to hear how the response changes. Or rather, let me ask you. Are you okay with me asking you?
Yes, no, that's fine.
Okay. All right. So, Batsiba, um,
Yes.
have you faced any challenges in your research journey?
Yes, but mostly being away from campus because I live in Mpumalanga province.
Okay.
And so being away from the university, not being able to access the university as much as I can. Yeah.
Okay.
And having a family. So this is my first time studying with being married and with my daughter. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's a different ball game altogether.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different ball game altogether. So, um, is do you like online learning?
It, so it's 50-50. The fact that I can study from anywhere, so that I enjoy. But
Mm-hmm.
then I do, it's gotten to a point where I miss having meetings, like in-person meetings with other students, or
Mm-hmm.
having to access to my supervisor in
Mm-hmm.
person, because we always have online meetings. So it has its pros and cons.
It
Yeah.
has its pros and cons. Okay.
Mm.
And were you nervous when you started your studies?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, definitely, because I I didn't even think I would get to a point where I do my PhD. I've always wanted
Mm.
that, but because I struggled with my masters, it yeah, it just starting my PhD was was
Mm.
a challenge. Yeah.
Mm.
But I've
Okay.
settled. I feel like now I'm more confident in my work, and the fact that I did my master's in chemical engineering and now I'm doing qualitative research. So it's
Yeah,
a
it's quite a jump.
jump. Yes, yes.
Yes, it is quite a jump. Okay. So
Mm.
what challenges have you faced in your research journey?
So, like I said, the distance, um, having to study with a family,
Mm-hmm.
not having the opportunity to do in-person sessions when I want to,
Mm-hmm.
or have contact, or be at the
Mm-hmm.
university when I want to. Yeah.
Okay, okay. And can you describe your experience with online learning?
So it's been challenging. Like I said, it's been
Mm,
50-50. It has its pros and cons. Like that
mm,
sometimes it's good that I can be in a different province and still be
and still,
registered
yeah,
with a with the university I
yeah,
prefer. But then it the social element,
yeah,
it's
is
it's hard.
lacking. Yeah, it's quite
Mm,
an isolating experience, and a PhD can
yes,
be
it
quite
is.
an isolating experience. But congratulations on making it
Thank
into the program. Okay.
thank you so much.
Okay, so Batsiba is an example of a great participant, right? The kind of participant you'd want to have because she elaborates on the question that you've posed her. But generally, you tend to have a bit of a mix with people. Where scene two, if you phrase questions as you did in scene two, although the question is phrased correctly, they are good questions. They are questions that would lend themselves a lot easier to a quantitative approach. Because if I ask someone, do you like learning? They can easily say, yes, I do, or no, I don't, without any further elaboration. But if I say, can you describe your experience with online learning? That's when you'd get the kind of answer that Batiba gave us, where she talks about challenges with her family, um, the feelings of isolation when you're working online, but also the benefits of being able to be in a different area and still be able to progress with your studies, right? So what I wanted to show you here is that you need to think really carefully that even though your question may be phrased well, you need to make sure that the question is open-ended and that it's actually asking what you are hoping it's asking so that you get the kind of answers that will help illuminate the question. Okay. I hope that illustrated it well enough. I'm going to quickly move on. I didn't get a sense of how much extra time you're giving me. Can you give me an indication?
We can do 15 minutes if that's all right.
That is more than enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to jump into data analysis with qualitative research a little bit. And one of the key things, like I mentioned earlier, right, is that when you're doing qualitative data analysis, you're likely going to be looking at a thematic analysis or doing some kind of codes. But the key is to think about how it is that you're going to interpret your findings. And part of doing that is grouping your findings. So depending on the research approach, it's not all going to look the same for each study, but there are certain basics that you need in order for you to understand the mass of data that you're going to have. Because when you're working with qualitative research, you typically have lots and lots of text, right? So if you are doing interviews, for example, you're going to, after the interview, transcribe it into a document, and from there you need to begin to draw out your themes, make codes, and all of that. So what I wanted us to do as an exercise, and this will need you guys to speak back to me, is to read, I'll leave it at one or two excerpts from interviews and then come up with codes that will help in your thematic analysis. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how it is that we should go about it. I'll do one with you and then you can do the next one by yourself. And I hope this will help you as you go about coding your data. Okay, so let's say I've conducted an interview about COVID-19. Right? So I went, interviewed a participant, went home, did my transcription. So now I have this written out and I'm going over the data. One of the things that I want you to please, 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 please do is that when you're in the field, keep a journal for yourself. It's called a research journal. And that's where you have your own notes about what happened in the field. So you tell me, you write for yourself, where's your participant tired? What was their body language? Did they look like they understood what you meant? Were there places where they paused more than usual or seemed maybe a bit distraught? Because those are the things that help you interpret what is written in the text as well. And it also helps you give a bit of a backdrop to the person who will be reading your research in future, right? So you want to have as much data as possible, and observation is part of this. So being able to have notes from what is actually happening out there in the field, just to help you later make sense of your data, or just remind yourself as you're going through the transcript of what it is that you saw and felt as part of the research process. Okay, so the first activity, we have this excerpt that says, working in the hospital during the pandemic was overwhelming. There were days that I felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The support from my colleagues helped a lot, and I felt proud to be part of a team that was making a difference. But I also worried constantly about bringing the virus home to my family. So, what you want to do when you're looking at a thematic analysis, right? It's often one guided by the literature that you've done so far. So, typically, what you would have seen already in the literature is that people are wrestling perhaps with the kind of anxiety that was brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, work life balance, um, juggling like experiences as, what should I say, frontline workers, right? So those are some of the themes that may have come up for you. And what you will be doing next is looking at particular codes that would fit into bigger overarching themes. So one of the codes that I would see from this excerpt, right, is working in the hospital during the pandemic was overwhelming. So I'd say one of my goals, oh, sorry, I just moved on to the next one. One of my goals would be emotional exhaustion. And under that code, I would have pandemic was overwhelming, felt exhausted emotionally, right? Another code could be physical exhaustion. That could be felt exhausted physically. Maybe if they spoke about working long hours, you'd put that under the code of physical exhaustion. Another code could be types of support. Then you could say support from colleagues or support from family if if the person spoke a bit more about their experience of getting support at family. But under the code of anxiety, you'd have something like you'd include anxieties about bringing the virus home to the family. So what the different codes under the themes do is help you group the data and see like what is coming up more often so that there's a pattern that is emerging. So similar to the way that quantitative people would be looking for things to count, like how many people felt anxious, or on a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious did you feel? What you are doing with the codes in qualitative research is seeing if it came up as a significant theme, right? So rather than trying to quantify, you're just trying to get a sense for yourself of, okay, what is coming up as significant themes? And with those themes, what are the different categories or codes that I can be looking at? So under the theme of anxiety, I could have anxiety of getting sick, anxiety of infecting my family, anxiety caused by being overworked physically and emotionally, right? So that's how the coding process works. It would need its own workshop for us to go into it in more depth, but perhaps we can do this coding activity, the second one, and I can have another volunteer to just share what codes or themes they think would come out of this excerpt. Okay. So this is one where they're talking about pollution, particularly water pollution. And the excerpt says, I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, and I've seen the river get more polluted every year. It's frustrating because we keep raising the issue at community meetings, but nothing seems to change. Some of my neighbors have given up, but I still believe we can make a difference if we keep trying. So could I have a volunteer, anyone at all, to talk about what codes or themes they see emerging in this excerpt? Anyone?
No one yet.
Okay, so would you guys like me to try do it?
Okay, I'm going to take the silence as a yes.
Okay. So what I'm noticing as possible codes here, right? Okay,
Sorry.
I have Spusiso.
Yes.
Okay, Spusiso. You can unmute.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Hi, Prof. Rafi. I wanted to react, but ended up raising my hand.
Oh, okay. So did you want me to try it?
Yeah, I wanted to say yes. Please go ahead and try it.
Okay. All right. So under this code, under this excerpt, there are a few codes that would come up, right? So one of the things that could be important for you is the length of time people have lived in particular communities. And you maybe might be interested in seeing like, okay, do people who have lived here longer, what have they seen and how invested are they in the issue of pollution? So you could say, have a theme called sense of belonging in the neighborhood, right? And maybe think about, okay, the research shows you that people who have a deeper sense of belonging to a particular neighborhood may be more invested in questions of pollution in that neighborhood. So under that theme of belonging, you could put in, I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, right? So length of time would be the code, and you'd have, I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years as your particular quote under that code. And then under that same code of belonging, you could have some of my neighbors have given up, but I still believe we can make a difference if we keep trying, right? So you can see that this person has a sense of investment and a sense of wanting to belong. So it would fit under that theme. And maybe your code would be um, making a difference or community. What can I say? What's a word that would work? Like community efforts as a code, and then you put your particular quotes under that code. So you could do this either using a software such as Atlas TI or in Vivo, or you could go old school, which I use the software, then usually end up going old school anyway, where you highlight, use different colors to indicate your themes, and then make a coding book for yourself where you write your codes and have associated quotes. So sometimes it's even like cutting and pasting particular quotes into the codes just so that you have a visual image for yourself. Another theme could be challenges raised by the community. A river gets more polluted every year, so under challenges, increased pollution could be a code. Another code, lack of response. So I'm not sure who the actor would be in this case. So maybe they're talking about the government or the municipality, right? That they keep raising the issue at the community meetings, but nothing changes. So lack of response could be another code. So basically what I'm trying to show you here is that you need to think about what are the broader themes drawing from your literature review that would be important in analyzing this data. And then under those themes, what are particular codes? So codes are kind of like categories or a family of ideas, and which particular quotes from your excerpts fit under each code, right? And that is how you begin to group your data in order to make sense of it. And then this helps you begin to write out your chapters based on particular themes so that you're able to speak to each theme quite neatly and draw out a story for your reader. Okay, so I'm going to end it here. Um, just with the re-emphasis that, the question of ethics, reliability, and validity of your data is really important. And I want you to challenge yourself to go beyond and ponder, think about what kind of approaches are helpful in the research that you want to do. Remember to keep thinking about whether it speaks to your research question and your research objectives. Does this method speak to your question? Does it speak to your objectives? Challenge yourself around questions of informed consent. Is it enough to just tell the person about the research, or do you need to break it down and explain the implications in different ways? Is there a way that you can extend authorship? Is confidentiality and anonymity the best approach for the research that you're doing? And how does your own positionality and your own bias affect the research? And how can you make this evident in a way that will help us be assured of the reliability and validity of your study? So I'm going to end it there. And I don't know if we have another minute or two for questions and answers.
Thank you so much for this very informative and comprehensive workshop. I think I speak for everybody here to say that you went above and beyond with this presentation, and we've really learned a lot. Myself specifically, I come from a chemistry background, so
Oh,
it's actually very, very interesting the way you explained it. It's actually very interesting. So I just want to thank you so much for your time and the tremendous effort that you've put in to prepare this presentation. We can really, or I can really see the amount of work that you've put in. Thank you so much for also supporting the RCD unit. We really do appreciate it.
thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, I see that there is a comment to say, please organize another session for the thematic analysis. Okay, I have taken that down and I will liaise with the team and then inform you of the outcome of that. But thank you so much for that suggestion. All right, we're opening the floor to questions, comments, suggestions. If there's something that you are unclear about, I think now is the time. And Ms. Bashanga has also put her email address in the chat, so you can contact her directly. But if there's something on your mind and you want some clarification, oh, Subsiso says, thank you for the presentation. I would like to know if there would be another session. Um,
Um, is that a question for you, for me?
I think for both, we can, Subsiso, we can arrange another session on the availability of Ms. Bashanga and if our schedule allows. So yes, we will also have a chat with the team and get back to you on that. Gloria says thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Gloria. So I would be happy to have another session. Yeah, so we can have a conversation about that.
Okay, okay, I will definitely contact you. Um, and then any other questions, comments, challenges? All right. In the absence of questions, I just want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you for your time and your support. And don't forget to fill in your feedback survey, so that we can understand how to improve in the future. And with that, Ms. Bashanga, any closing words from you?
No, just please try to think deeply about your research and let your interests guide you. Let the knowledge that you have from your context guide you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the kind of scholars you'll be and the work you will release in future. And hopefully we speak soon.
Definitely. Thank you so much for those last words. All right. With that, I just want to bring this workshop to a close. I'm wishing everybody a wonderful and blessed afternoon, and I hope to see you all in future workshops. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
I see Afika asked for my email address. It is in the chat, Afika.
Yes. There we go, Afika. If you haven't um, seen it, just put it in there now. All right. Okay, thank you. I'm now going to end the recording. Ms. Bashonga, I will be in contact with
Okay.
you soon. Thank you
Okay.
so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right. Bye.
Bye, guys. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks. You too.